So welcome to the first of three sessions today and one tomorrow morning, and then the final one tomorrow afternoon, on climate development and the politics of participation. This session has been convened by myself, Bobby Farnham, and Richard Friend at the University of York, and also Ari Fraser at the University of Nottingham, bringing together two GCRF projects that are in different ways concerned with the politics of participation, particularly in urban settings. But for this panel, we're certainly not confining ourselves to questions of the urban, but we are concerned about how in recent times issues of systemic uncertainty and risk have become central to both development practice, development researchers and climate researchers. And for many responses to the twin challenges of climate and development, we see participation as being held out as holding great hope for resolving the complexity and uncertainty that faces both programs of work. But developments in both fields, I guess, have questioned the potential of participation as a transformative agenda. And with this panel, we're starting to think about taking seriously the democratic deficits and questions about political capability that I guess start to challenge or potentially open up a new front in how we understand the role of participation in climate and development. So we're looking to bring together scholarship that addresses bottom-up and everyday political development, and bring to that empirical, methodological and theoretical insights that help us rethink climate politics, sustainable development and participation together. And I hope is that through this session today and over the next two sessions tomorrow, we can start to draw important lessons from each other in order to critically address marginalisation and subjectivity and reveal the long-standing conceptual and practical limits that participatory development has placed on climate politics. With that, I guess there's a few housekeeping concerns. The first is to say that I'd like us to go through all three of the presentations in the hope that we do have all three presentations today before we open up for questions. But please do post questions into the chat throughout. And I think that's actually a really great way to help us collect thoughts and reactions as we move through the session. Aside from that, can we have cameras off while the presentations are taking place? Richard was saying that his experience in earlier sessions is that this has really helped, particularly for those with low bandwidth. And what I will do is I'll try and keep time for each of the presentations. And I'm going to keep us all to a strict 15 minutes. And I'll do a brief introduction for each of the presenters before they start. So with no further ado, our first presenter is Bobby Farnham, one of the conveners of the panel today. Bobby's a postdoc at the University of York, based at Stockholm Environment Institute, and is working on the GCRF Transforming Political Capabilities for Equitable Resilience project, where we're focused on work in Nepal and Thailand. Bobby's got a background in political science and has done extensive ethnographic research in Burma, focusing on resource conflict. I think that's accurate, isn't it, Bobby? Excellent. So I'm going to hand over to Bobby and start my stopwatch.
Right. Okay. I'll try to maintain time within that stopwatch. Let's see. Let's get this up here. Okay, is that viewable for everyone? It's okay. Thanks. Morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. So today I'm going to be talking about the first paper that's come out of the project that John's just mentioned here. We're kind of in the midst of finalizing this paper. So yeah, your critical comments and reflections on the presentation are really, really most welcome. So urban informality knowledge infrastructures and the political capabilities of planning in Nepal and Thailand. So I'll just start with, let me just close this here so I can actually see. I'll just start with some of the key points that we try to unpack in the paper. One of the key questions that the paper tries to propose revolves around how a city or a society might fit together. It asks, in broad strokes, how a city, to what extent a city could be said to have an identity, and if it does have an identity or a definable character, where might we look for it? Would we find it in law, in planning documents, in cultural patterns, or indeed in power relations? If a particular civic identity, for example, becomes hegemonic or comes to dominate a city, what happens to diversity and for the members, all of the members of that city? What are the normal contours, in other words, of a city or a society, and what might be considered normal in urban life? So this is kind of a broad kind of conceptual question that drives the paper. What is a normal city like? And how does city planning produce this idea of normality? And how indeed will this relate to kind of two of the dominant conceptual categories used in city planning, that is formality or informality. The third kind of key point that the paper tries to unpack is this idea that planning documents themselves are a kind of knowledge infrastructure. So I'll go into greater detail about what we mean by knowledge infrastructure, but for the time being, the basic idea is that infrastructures are not just material structures, but they're also made up of social materials. For example, ideas, rules, norms, and so forth. Therefore, one of the key claims we make, and nothing particularly groundbreaking in that respect, is that we need to pay greater attention to language and power. The concept of knowledge infrastructure complicates this understanding of language and power because it situates it within broader social and political networks, which I'll touch upon shortly. Okay, so the research question or problem, as I mentioned, that drives the paper is this question of how a city is defined. So in other words, what norms or values are realized in planning for a city and a part of the process of designing its infrastructure. Who's included in this process? Who's tasked, for example, with protecting the public good, indeed for defining what the public good is, and for distributing social provisions to the inhabitants of a city. As part of this, the paper argues that there's three key elements to urban planning that we need to pay greater attention to. One, decision, two, distribution, and thirdly, value. So city planning that's associated with informal formal transitions, or what's often called informal urbanization, are increasingly shaped by political capabilities of those who live in informal settlements. And therefore, we need to understand these three elements of urban planning in order to understand how marginalization can be entrenched and uneven developmental impacts, disaster risks, and vulnerabilities may be exacerbated. So central to how we go about our study is a consideration of the relationship between equity on the one hand and capability on the other. We make the claim that any consideration of social political equity must take into account social vulnerability and political exclusion, not simply at a kind of a base physical or material level through, for example, the breakdown of physical infrastructure within an urban system, but also by paying greater attention to the discourses and narratives through which marginalized groups might be able to access decision-making as equal partners within the city. So that's the kind of broad, I guess, research problematic or set of questions that drives this paper. So now just a bit of the historical and theoretical context of our work. So the paper begins by looking at the technocratic approach that has come to dominate urban planning in both Thailand and Nepal. It talks about how this characteristic is kind of defined by a fidelity to formal modes of governance, and that largely this has remained unchallenged within the state bureaucracies and indeed within the city planning documents since the first half of the 20th century. Okay, as part of this, there is a tendency to kind of, there's kind of a tendency to over-rely on scientific and technical reasoning in the governance of urban life. One of the key arguments we make in the paper is that this technocratic mode of governance inherently reduces the social and the complexity that makes up social urban life and the risk that's entailed into that as something that can be overcome through a purely technical operation, rather than something that's inherently political, social, or indeed potentially a kind of a cultural problem. Okay, so the authority that is kind of sought by the technocratic planning model, we argue, and this is where the knowledge infrastructure aspect of our work comes in, we argue that it cannot be achieved without a degree of stability and consensus over who or what is included in any given definition of the urban. So this is a question that revolves around the policing of the boundary between what is considered formal to a city and what is considered so-called informal. The claim we make is that this results in a process of definition. So the question of definition, again, language is central, for instance, around how informality is understood, and that this potentially opens up a type of politics of exclusion or marginalization in which other ways of knowing or being in an urban environment are subjugated or deferred. So one of the central things we do in the paper is we explore the counter-hegemonic or alternative framings of informality and how that relates to the dominant framings of formality within urban planning in Nepal and Thailand. Okay, as I mentioned, the central concept that we utilize in our work is this idea of the knowledge infrastructure. So one of the claims we make is that planning documents are a type of social technical object that are embodied in, again, what we call knowledge infrastructure. So this is a relational understanding of planning that takes into consideration not just the role of humans, but also material relations. So we look at actors, organizations, but also technical devices, objects, such as maps, land use plans, etc., zoning regulations that are bound up in informal processes of knowledge co-production. What this kind of relational approach to urban planning is suggestive of is the way in which urban life, the city, is inherently networked and indeed malleable and open to negotiation and contestation. The knowledge infrastructure's central significance to our work, as understood as a socio-technical object, revolves or rests around along two things, basically. So the first is that, as I mentioned, it's a stable network of actors and institutions, as well as associated techno-scientific practices that maintain and disseminate specific forms of expertise and knowledge about urban planning. And this dissemination of particular specific forms of knowledge through the knowledge infrastructure has impacts on how particular groups are marginalized within a city and the capabilities that they may or may not have in relation to decision-making and control over their own environment. The second central significance of the concept is that it's inherently political and that it emphasizes that the process of co-production is certainly not a linear process, but an emergent co-productive process that is open to contestation and dispute. Okay, so just quickly to some of our findings in brief. We organize our findings around kind of three sub-themes. These are narrative strategies and contestations. So the question of definition regarding the boundaries and the limits of urban life in both Nepal and Thailand have largely come to revolve around narratives of urban risk associated with what's quite prevalent, these notions of degradation and notions of productivity. As I'll touch upon shortly, these notions of urban risk associated with degradation and productivity are grounded in a state-centric set of set of notions of belonging connected to modern land relations, and more specifically to ideas of legibility, ideas of improvement and waste that are indeed bound up in kind of modernist notions of technocratic planning.
5 minutes, Bobby.
5 minutes, okay. All right, I'll swiftly move on. So these ideas of degradation of productivity, for example, are connected to narratives of urban risk, enable different logics of belonging and community to be imagined. For example, around the claims made by landless migrants in the Kathmandu Valley, the so-called Sukambasi. In Thailand, at the level of national planning, the issue of informal settlements is not as prevalent, but is rather hidden under a variety of general terms that describe the poor, largely around narratives of degradation, productivity, and economic inequality. Okay, I'll move swiftly through these set of findings and try to get to kind of our general conclusions. But what we can see is that the technocratic approach to urban planning presupposes at its heart a rationale of legibility. This modern desire of legibility manifests alongside ideas of improvement that reduce social complexity and make spaces for populations to be made legible for developmental interventions, the most prominent of which are evictions, relocations, and housing developments. Some of the narratives that emerge ascribe informal spaces as spaces of encroachment, and show how the planning work by civil society groups, for example, in Nepal, revolve around trying to counter these dominant narratives. So what you see is that there are two forms of political contestation that largely emerge. In Nepal, for example, there's ones around ecological narrative, around restoration, that emerge around informal settlements, and another around narratives around housing. As part of this, new forms of knowledge infrastructure are deployed to help booster these counter-hegemonic narratives. So such technologies include alternative planning technologies such as ID cards, which can be understood here as a type of insurgent planning document. Perhaps I'll talk about the Thai case, perhaps in the discussion that comes. I'll just move swiftly to some of the general conclusions that the paper makes, because I think I'm running a bit short on time. So what the paper ultimately asks here, in kind of broad strokes, is how things have come to be like this, how informality, generally speaking, has been marginalized within urban planning documents, right? So within urban planning documents, within the maps, informal settlements are largely absent from the process of legibility that I've been describing in terms of technocratic planning. One of the questions we ask is how things might have been different, right? Or why things might stay the same, why have things changed, or how things can change from the bottom up. In other words, how do ideas work? Do they cause us to do X rather than Y? How are we persuaded, for example, through knowledge infrastructures to do X rather than Y? So broadly, how do agents like cities or individuals affect the capabilities in and through which they live? And how do these capabilities shape those cities and individuals? And more generally, what are these urban capabilities made of? What our papers suggest is that they're not only made up of physical materials such as walls, pipes, electricity, paved roads, locked doors, etc. But more crucially, and something that we really need to consider, we argue, is the social material, the idea of rules, norms, the language that comprise the political capabilities of urban planning. So this would require greater consideration of some of the following categories, such as race, religion, gender. If we are to think of both capabilities and cities, that capabilities and cities are made, we need to study urban planning as a process of social construction that's inherently bound up with power relations. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Bobby, with 30 seconds to spare. So, Bobby, can we stop your screen sharing? Perfect.
Yep.
Okay. As I said at the start, if we can hold on to questions for a Q&A session once the presenters have finished speaking, that would be great. But if you've got any thoughts or ideas or responses reflections that are bubbling up, please feel free to put them in the chat. I think it's a great way to kind of keep hold of ideas, make sure we don't lose comments, and we can always come back to them in the discussion session in a short while. Our next presentation is from Ronan McDermott. Ronan is a postdoc currently at the University of Nottingham, working with the GCRF hub Tomorrow's Cities. So Ronan's research interests focus on disaster risk, and he's currently engaged in exploring the root causes of disaster risk, in particular through the project in the 4 cities that Tomorrow's Cities is focused on, which Ronan might very well touch on in the presentation. So Ronan, over to you.
Thanks, John. I hope you can all see the slide clearly. So you might notice that the title is somewhat different to the one included in the program. The paper is entitled Providing a Grounded Understanding of Systemic Risk, an Event-Focused Approach. So this paper has been developed since January 2021 as part of the Tomorrow's Cities project. And I'm presenting today on behalf of multiple authors from both African Centre for Technology Studies in Nairobi and the University of Nottingham. And word of thanks also to John Enser and to Arabella Fraser for guidance in preparing this paper, which is very much a work in progress. Really looking forward to feedback that you have. Just to give you an overview of the paper, the focus is on how the systemic nature of risk is being increasingly acknowledged, and the implications that this has for traditional risk assessment approaches, how to account for the emergence and realization of systemic risk, and we'll describe what's systemic risk in brief shortly. Given the novel nature of systemic risk, there's an identified need for thicker descriptions, more qualitative, in-depth account of the way in which systemic risks emerge and become realized. And we'll present a work in progress whereby we try to operationalize an event-focused approach, so a disaster event-focused approach to systemic risk, whereby we look at the broader systemic generation of fire and flooding within an informal urban setting in Nairobi. So what do we mean by systemic risk? Systemic or network risk draws attention to the interconnected nature of the elements within a system and the prospect of failure or shock or stresses that affect one element of the system, in turn affecting the wider system. This occurs through complex interactions featuring risk concatenations, so the emergence of different kinds of risks and feedback loops in complex patterns that magnify potential loss. Systemic risk draws attention not only to the primary impact of disaster events, but also secondary and tertiary impacts across time and space. So not only the immediate impact of a fire and flood, for example, but also the impact on livelihoods and further knock-on impacts within a system. Systemic risk is an overview of systemic risk is provided in the figure on the slide from the 2019 Global Assessment Report, whereby risk drivers are acknowledged to extend beyond immediate hazard, vulnerability, and exposure drivers to include more spatially and temporally distant, yet systemically interlinked drivers. In the literature, systemic risk is often related to large-scale challenges such as the global financial crisis of the late 2000s or the prospect of multiple breadbasket failure. It is acknowledged here for our purposes, however, that these systemic risks cascade downwards to the local level, and processes at the local level carry implications for risk at higher levels. As such, the study focuses primarily on the city and sub-city level, but with broader spatial and temporal linkages very much of interest in explaining how disaster events arise and then subsequently their implications. And while natural hazards might not generate in themselves a systemic risk, where they are recurrent in nature and interact within a wider context of vulnerabilities of infrastructure, industrial activities, structural developments, and behavioral patterns, so phenomena that are quite common in complex urban systems, the impact of these recurrent natural hazards in the broadest sense can be considered systemic in nature. With that in mind, what is the research problem that the study addresses? While the introduction of a systems approach provides more sophisticated understanding of the ontological nature of risk pathways, it potentially further complicates the epistemic challenges relating to the explaining causality, how to explain how risks emerge in practice when we cannot rely on linear causal relationships. Related problems how to operationalize a systems approach to study of risk and make it conducive to productive investigation. This endeavor remains embryonic and is particularly the case for studies of complex systems incorporating a social science dimension. Social and natural worlds inherently present different epistemological challenges. Any such operationalization needs to transcend assumptions of linear relationships, as mentioned before, between risk, root causes, and disaster events, and unpack the broader systemic rootedness of risk. And it's this complexity that renders the reimagination of investigations necessary. It is also being recognized that the deepest insights about system complexity stem from historical, ethnographic, and other qualitative approaches, and these are beginning to complement the emerging statistical modeling techniques that are trying to unravel and unpack systemic risks. Building on recent efforts to bring qualitative methods to the study of systems, the foreign approach adds value by offering a thick description of the causal mechanisms involved in determining the conditions under which urban systems manifest risk. Understanding the complexity of causality in urban systems is best achieved through such an approach to the study of carefully selected disaster events as manifestations of disaster risks. This is the event-focused approach of our paper. This qualitative approach also resonates with the increasing tendency towards the recognition of interdependencies and relationships rather than the measurement of probabilities within risk analysis. And given the complexity of causal relationships when we consider systemic risk, the tracing of lines of accountability for risk becomes problematic, something that permeates the study. So with this in mind, we develop a typology of risk root causes centered around physical, socioeconomic, and governance and institutional risk root causes. Approaching the physical drivers of risk through the lens of systemic risk demands greater attention to the multi-hazard interactions at play and the introduction of risk dynamism contingent across time and space. This perspective draws attention to the complex interactions between hazard types and also events occurring within recurrent patterns. It's recognized that compound or cascading multi-hazards and recurrent events can have a cumulative effect upon the wider system that far exceeds the sum total of their primary impacts. Over time, nonlinear processes have the potential to lead a secondary emergency to become the source of major crisis. And the potential for such complex interaction between physical drivers tends to be amplified in the densely populated and interconnected urban setting. Looking at institutional drivers of risk, the role of governance arrangements and such institutional drivers of risk in determining disaster risk has been well recognized. Even within the broader risk assessment literature, there's an increasing shift away from the mechanics of risk assessment to understanding the embeddedness of risk analysis within wider social and institutional processes, in line with the expectations of adaptive governance, but also implications for the extent to which institutions can intentionally engage with risk when a system perspective is adopted and linear assumptions underpinning interventions fall away. Perhaps a link here with aspects of the paper that preceded. In terms of socioeconomic drivers, a number of comments can be made. Firstly, in the urban system, there's greater sensitivity to socioeconomic change at higher scales, nationally or internationally, due to the openness of the system and the commodification of livelihoods. There's a need to engage with this commodification of livelihoods in urban areas in the political economy of risk. The increased mobility within the urban setting is also significant for both disaster risk accumulation and attenuation, and contributes to complexity. So with this in mind, the paper is has generated the following research questions. How do the systemic origins of risk account for the occurrence of recurrent events in urban settings? We've split that up into 3 sub-questions, one more conceptual in nature, and much of what I've said before is aimed at addressing that question. In operationalizing this or addressing the second sub-question, how are the systemic origins of risk and the manifestation of recurrent events interrelated in urban environments? We're adopting a case study approach within Mukuru, an informal settlement in Nairobi, which I'll talk about briefly shortly. Then we're also ultimately interested in finding pathways to risk reduction, accountability, and conceptual framings for wider application. So I mentioned at the outset that the work is rooted within forensic investigation of disasters, and these existing approaches to foreign, as they're called, provide scope to comprehend the complexity that generates systemic risk. As per such studies that trace disaster risk root causes, an event-focused approach is being adopted, and in-depth case studies are appropriate where the research objective is to explore contextual, unknown, or complex multivariate conditions, such as we have in this study. The case study included as part of the project is Mukuru in Nairobi. It's currently designated as special planning area, whereby the national Nairobi county government and a range of other stakeholders are engaged in a process of transforming a slum area of 650 acres by providing a legal basis to development within the area and plans to invest in infrastructure upgrading and community-based planning. The area is subject to both recurrent fire and riverine and pluvial flooding. So before engaging in data collection as part of research planning, a range of initiatives were adopted to stimulate interdisciplinary engagement to obtain that sort of holistic overview of the socioeconomic, physical, and institutional drivers of risk. So these consultations or initiatives within the project involve both hazard scientists and social scientists. We undertook initial expert-informed root cause analysis mapping to begin identifying the broad systemic drivers of risk in Mukuru ahead of data collection, as well as soliciting input from experts across the hub concerning how our approach is best achieved as summarized in the word cloud. We had a special interdisciplinary session as well, which was undertaken at the initiative of hazard scientists or fire hazard scientists who were struggling to understand how the ignition of fire emerged from socioeconomic sources within informal settlements. So that was a very useful deliberation process between the various disciplines within the project. we are adopting an event-focused approach, so the careful selection of fire and flooding events in Nakuru for further investigation is key to providing a baseline understanding of contemporary risk emergence. It essentially acts as a focusing event or boundary object for broader interdisciplinary and stakeholder engagement to really tease out those complex causal processes.
Ronan, you've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, the current work planned involves focus group discussions with policymakers that have been assembled as part of the wider Tomorrow Cities project, planning an initial focus group discussion to engage in the selection of events for further investigation, followed by follow-up interviews, further key informant interviews, and then also engagement with disaster management officials and other snowball sampling approaches as we move out from the immediate impact of the fire and flooding events that we select in Nakuru to identify the broader systemic contributors to the realization of risk within those particular events. So that's where we're at the moment. There's several co-authors on the call who we might be able to address any questions within the discussion. So yeah, I might leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronan. Extremely timely. I started my stopwatch a little bit late, so I think you might have been closer to spot on 15 minutes. Do we have anybody here who is representing Jessica Alvarez, who was supposed to be up next as a presenter? I'm guessing not, but speak now if you're here on her behalf. Okay, well, in the absence of Jessica, it looks like we've got a substantial amount of time for comment and discussion. The way I think I'd like to suggest that we run this is, again, feel free to offer questions into the chat box at any time. We've got various representatives of the kind of panel conveners who are here, who might want to kick us off with any questions that have occurred to you as the two presentations have gone forward. So that's myself, Richard, Ari, and Bobby. And then really, I don't want to stop anybody from speaking who has thoughts or questions they'd like to raise. So please just raise your hand using the reactions tool on. Well, I'm using Zoom, so using the reaction tool on Zoom, or otherwise turn your camera on and wave furiously, and I shall identify you. It would be great if we could have cameras on during this part of the meeting, just so that we can all make contact and see each other's faces and pretend like things are normal again. So, do we have any reflections or questions to kick off before I dive in with my initial reactions? Charles. Hi.
Yes, thank you so much, John, and thanks for the presenters. I'm Charles Tonui. I'm one of the researchers under the Nairobi Risk Hub that is supported by Tomorrow Cities, and I work closely with Ronan. I've seen Arabella, and of course John himself. And this is a question to Bobby. In his presentation, he brought out one of the key concepts they're looking at is especially power. And in my interaction so far as a risk policy analyst in Nairobi, I looked at power relation being a key factor that is actually shaping not only risk at the coastal level, but also at the policy level. So from your perspective, are you going to address, or have you looked at in terms of the power relations among the different players is going to still shift more kind of energies to the upper systems rather than really supporting the bottom-up system, because that is what you are really trying to look at in Kenya through the not only foreign but also using the political economy to really understand the power relations. And then, of course, secondly, is a comment. Of course, I'll build on what Ronan, in case of any question. Yeah, thank you.
Bobby, do you want to dive in?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Charles. Thanks for your question. I didn't quite catch the last bit about upper systems. Do you think you could just kind of repeat that really briefly?
Yeah, yes. Are you looking at, or have you found out kind of there is that direction that the power relations is going to shift more energy to the upper systems within the developing cities, like especially at the high-level policy influence, the invisible brokers within the city?
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Yeah. So I understand. I think one of the things that the project as a whole aims to do is look at the question of decision making around power, and the use or kind of the development of this concept of the knowledge infrastructure is one way that we're trying to think about political capability and decision making, kind of complicate the story a little bit and show how decision making is embedded in a broader set of institutions or networks that rely on different forms of technical expertise, for example. And if we are to intervene in decision-making at the kind of the upper system level, as you describe it, then we need to have a better understanding of the type of narratives that are wielded at that level and how we might strategically want to engage with certain actors to reshape those narratives, for example, around informality, informal settlement. So this is certainly something that we are looking at, but we look at it through this concept of a knowledge infrastructure. So we look at power not as something, I think it's safe to make this claim, as not something that is lodged at a particular scale, but something that's diffuse across different institutions, but also through different artifacts, such as the planning document. So we're trying to complicate that picture around power, certainly. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Charles, did you have a follow-up comment that you wanted to make in relation to Ronan's presentation?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks, Ronan, for really presenting our thinking. And of course, you've been the lead, especially in the drafting the paper and the ideas. What is the most important thing is, especially for Nairobi, is to understand the different, the various causes of the various risk or hazards. I think that is why we are lacking, because from the preliminary analysis that I've done from the policy perspective and the interactions with both the high level and the community-based leaders, is that there are different causes of the different risks, but the challenge is we cannot demarcate, we cannot confidently say this is the cause of this particular risk. And then again, more complicated is we don't understand the interactions of those causes, and that is why we are really hoping, especially to operation, to use the foreign to really support us, because then we'll answer the question around how can we facilitate integrated approach to towards disaster risk reduction, both at the city level, but of course at the local level, and then across the horizontal at the different sector levels. So we are conscious about that, and of course we are building on the multi-level policy dialogues we have already facilitated over the last 1 year. I think Nairobi, we have got a very strong case in terms of strong relations with the city. I'm actually the researcher directly linked with the city, so we have got that regular interaction. Even when they are initiating other initiatives, they are really picking us as one of the technical teams to provide that support. But the question around various causes and how those causes shape also, or all the new infrastructure that is driven towards the informal settlement to reduce risks, how they are interacting, is the area that is still gray for us and the different stakeholders. So those are the areas that we hope especially to have some kind of concrete answers in the next 1 or 2 years, so that we can confidently say we are supporting the city towards integrated DRR planning. So we look forward for more learning, actually, not only this year, but also the next year and the future. Thank you so much.
I can see there are 1 or 2 questions starting to bubble up, but also that Jessica has overcome her technical challenges and is now with us. Jessica, if you're ready to present, we'll just interrupt the questions and dive straight into your presentation. So I'll give a brief introduction, and then you'll have 15 minutes, and then we'll be straight into the Q&A for all of the 3 panelists today. So without further ado, Jessica's an architect with experience in community development projects, urban territorial planning and climate change adaptation. She's worked on urban regeneration in Lima, Peru, including as an advisor for the Metropolitan Development Plan for 2040. She's an associate researcher at the Center for Research on Architecture in the City at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. And I think if all that's correct, then Jessica, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, and sorry for the delay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can you please confirm, are you looking at my screen?
Yes, we are. We can see it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the delay again. So, yes, my name is Jessica Alvarez, and the following paper was written as part of my master's dissertation, in which I tried to understand a little bit about my own working practice. And after a long time, I had a question in my head that said, how can we as designers can conduct and deliver more just projects that positively impact people in the current climate crisis? And this is how I came up with this thesis about framing nature-based solutions through environmental and epistemic justice. The following presentation is organized in this way. We're going to talk about nature-based solutions, what are the weaknesses and unintended injustices that I found out, and how can we frame nature-based solutions with environmental and epistemic justice, and how nature-based solutions are integrated concepts such as recognition and participation, particularly for indigenous knowledge in the concept of nature-based solutions, and finally the conclusions. So nature-based solutions as a term was first coined by international organizations such as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the World Bank, the UN, and so on. And the International Union for Conservation of Nature defines nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And they can take several names like ecosystem-based adaptation, green or natural infrastructure, ecological restoration, and so on. A famous example is what we're seeing on the screen. It's the management of mangroves for the mangroves ecosystem to protect coastal areas. However, nature-based solutions are also ancestral practices developed by indigenous and local peoples based on a deep relationship with the environment and the understanding of the ecosystem, such as the millennial practices of harvesting rainwater or much more complex solutions such as agricultural terraces in the Andes. As we can see, nature-based solution is an umbrella concept still in progress to refer to any intervention that harness natural ecosystems and their benefits. Due to the increasing influence of nature-based solutions in global environmental policy, many authors have covered some of the weaknesses that this intervention is still present in terms of weak adaptive management or governance, dealing with ecological complexity and uncertainty, multi-stakeholder participation, and knowledge co-production. However, little attention has been given to the questioning of the epistemological origin and related political significance of the concept and the unintended injustices nature-based solutions can promote. Cotzile et al. Argues that nature-based solutions can promote the neoliberalization of nature and thus lead to the reproduction of inequalities and injustices embedded in neoliberal political and economic systems. Thus, nature is seen as an asset through which we can accumulate capital. In these terms, that nature can be manipulated and commodified without consideration of the value of non-replicable human-nature interactions. Moreover, some social ecological trade-offs are often already determined by nature-based solution schemes before implementation, failing to allow for negotiation for the vision, interest, priorities towards nature, which can compromise its aims of democracy and justice at the end. Some unintended injustices manifest in forms of land grabbing. So, for example, in the REDD project, these are nature-based solution schemes to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation by purchasing land for carbon stocks. But there's another injustice related to nature-based solutions, in this case related to reduction of biodiversity. This is the introduction of non-native monoculture in natural ecosystems that are more profitable for commercial purposes, but are more also vulnerable to diseases and climate variability, which in turn negatively impacts indigenous people's lands and their livelihood. To counteract this, nature-based solution schemes have, in some cases, deployed economic incentives called payments for ecosystem services to agricultural communities, for example, to be involved in conservation or adaptation strategies. However, when these schemes are too centered in the economic incentives, it can also rule out other schemes that are more relevant for the long-term adaptation, like providing support over agricultural or social arrangements for better water supply. So many of these conflicts stem from opposing ontological and epistemological notion of nature. The notion of humanity's domination over nature underpins Eurocentric Western knowledge systems that have spread through the expansion of capitalism. And this knowledge system is imposed as neutral and superior to other knowledge. In this sense, nature-based solution and its inclination towards neoliberalization means that it is impossible to consider such interventions as neutral solutions. According to Santos, to counter the hegemony of Cartesian knowledge systems, we need to develop an ecology of knowledges. And this is to recognize that we live in a world with epistemic diversity, and in allowing for a diversity of knowledge, offer a challenge to the normative lenses through which the concept of nature-based solutions is viewed. So, to frame nature-based solutions in environmental and epistemic justice, so I use the theory of Scholber's, which provides a comprehensive understanding of justice that expands the liberal concept of this word. So for Scholber's, justice happens through the negotiation between 4 dimensions: distribution, recognition, participation, and capability buildings, in which recognition and participation are intertwined concepts and preconditions for the others. On the other hand, epistemic justice theory by Fricker reveals 2 mechanisms that can explain how and why we tend to undermine indigenous and local people as valid knowledge holders, and what is needed to overcome epistemic oppression. Testimonial justice, for example, says that when it happens when someone, testimonial injustice happens when someone is disbelieved in his or her capacity as knowledge giver due to prejudice based on gender, race, class. And it is this that leads to the misrecognition of someone as invalid knowledge holder. Hermeneutical injustice is the lack of understanding about a social group experiences due to the structural prejudice over such group. And this happens amongst other reasons because of unequal participation or exclusion of this social group from making sense processes and institutions. In this sense, it suggested that the focus or a focus on recognition and participation appears as a precondition to tackle social environmental justice. And for a deeper understanding of these 2 concepts, I will refer to Iris Young and Nancy Fraser's theories. So recognition, I refer to the recognition of group difference and the need for challenging institutions of oppressions and recognition of differences in social groups at an institutional and political level, and the self-awareness of one's rights. And the dimension of participation relies heavily on Fraser's parity of participation as the social arrangements that permit all other members of society to interact with one another as peers. So what is different in indigenous and local knowledge that need to be recognized, and what does it take to address the recognition of indigenous and local knowledge in nature-based solutions? First, there is no one conception of indigenous and local knowledge, and some such knowledge systems are always plural. Moreover, it has been argued by the colonial authors that they are equally valid and complex as Western knowledge. Escobar defines indigenous knowledge as relational onto epistemologies, wherein the knowing, the being, and the doing are integrated. Human and non-human nature are radically interdependent, in contrast to the dual ontology of scientific knowledge in which humans are considered separated from and dominant over nature. Berkes points out that some conflicts between Western experts and indigenous experts are about power relations and authority over land and resources, and that this relationality to a territory is a key point of contestation. In another way, indigenous and local knowledge holders have a different way of experiencing and related to the world, and it is through this that Western societies have to negotiate to find a common politics to share the world we live in.
5 minutes, Jessica. 5 minutes.
Thank you. So recognizing the dwelling space in nature-based solutions, we can apply the dwelling space concept from Roth, which is constituted as land tenure institutions, land use patterns, and force-based activities. And these are social arrangements characterized by the shift between private and communal properties that seasonally change and also change according to the needs that arise within community life, which vary greatly depending on gender and the changes of the physical environment and the availability of the resources. So taking into account the diversity of communities, this variable also might differ. But the bottom line is that
I don't think it's working. It's
No,
probably her connection.
Okay, well, with luck, she will reappear. Assuming that she does not, can we return to the questions that we were starting to pose a few moments ago when Charles, we just finished Charles's response to Ronan's presentation, and I'm aware that there's also a question in the chat from Ari. Ari, are you there? Do you want to narrate your own question to Bobby?
Hi, John. Hi, all. Sorry, it's a bit of a chaotic time of day, so I'll try and jump in. Thanks, Bobby, for just obviously jumping back from nature-based solutions to really rich urban planning. You know, such a rich presentation, fascinating. I just want to say there's lots of parallels in other contexts, so that always kind of should embolden you as a researcher. But I'm working in Karachi, where this question of labelling as encroachers is also really significant and paving the way for evictions, very violent evictions, actually. So that would be fascinating to discuss a bit more, but lots of resonance with work I've done in Bogota, so that's where some of these questions come from. So I wanted to slightly muddy your waters, you know, just by being in a kind of constructive vein, but this question about whether these binaries are too oppositional, of kind of seeing the state and seeing like the state, whether actually technocratic knowledge actually comes laden with a load of politics and values, and I think actually you're pointing that out as well, but being more explicit about that. But also often social groups, you know, find ways to mirror the states, adopt identities or categories in particular moments as politically strategic, to kind of try and find footholds or ways in. So I wonder whether that picture is a bit more blurry. but also the difference between kind of formal planning tools as knowledge infrastructures, but then the practices of planning. And obviously here there's a vast literature about actually planning as a very informal practice. And this is certainly a distinct I would recognise, kind of do an interview in a chief planning office and the map is empty. Go out to the field and planners are engaged in talking to people they know very well are there and trying to find ways to kind of resolve dilemmas. And the third thing is about discourse, really. And you said change the discourse, and of course we want to change the discourse, but I wonder if there's kind of deeper ideas here from the idea of discourse coalitions, that actually umbrella concepts can be adopted by multiple groups who don't necessarily have the same interests, but can kind of allow politics to proceed. So they're not necessarily oppositional discourses, but how do you find, or are there narrative or visions of the city around which people can come around and find acceptability, even if, you know, they actually have very different interests. And then I put a question for Ronan, obviously know his work well, but just wondered if anyone had any reflections on whether this notion of systemic risk helps us in terms of enabling participation, in that it can bring us closer to kind of local accounts of risk, which are often about multiple risks. You know, people don't just talk singularly kind of about landslides or about the way that governance architectures are often divided up and our analytical categories for research are often divided up. And obviously many kind of local everyday risks are not systemic risks, so there's some kind of ontological distinctions there. But I just wonder if there is a potential for a discourse that has been quite technocratic, focused on kind of big data modeling, but as it moves to become more qualitative and ethnographic, could this be a way kind of forward? So there's some thoughts.
Thank you, Ari. That's a lot of thoughts and directed at both Bobby and Ronan. Does anybody want to jump in first? Bobby, you've had the longest run at this.
Yeah, yeah, I agree completely, Ari, on the kind of the first point, right, between seeing like a state versus seeing the state. So definitely, like, the thing that we are trying to achieve in the paper is blurring that distinction. It's by no means trying to kind of reinstate that binary. I think one way of trying to think about it, or that I'm attempting to try to think about it, is looking at technocratic forms of urban governance as a mode of planning, not necessarily kind of tied to the state, right? Or not having to be tied to the state completely, but something that can be dislodged through kind of forms of kind of non-hegemonic forms of counter-planning, participatory planning, and so forth. So I think one of the examples of this would be kind of, or one of the ways in which kind of this dominant form of technocratic planning is disputed or contested is through, in the case of Nepal, these kind of counter identity or these ID cards. So these are kind of insurgent planning technologies, if you like. But one of the things that I think that poses is the extent to which those technologies are truly transformative, in the sense that they challenge the dominant mode in which people identify as belonging to the city, right? So if the terms of belonging are still dominated by the categories of the state or of technocratic planning, to what extent are kind of these ID cards actually subverting that, or indeed, yeah, so that's kind of one kind of aspect that I would kind of point to. And then it brings the question of the connection between, I suppose, planning and particular forms of knowledge, like technical expertise, and the extent to which these relate to kind of political capability. It's a bit muddied in my head, but I do agree completely in terms of this kind of being sure to make this distinction between how technocratic knowledge becomes kind of embodied within kind of counter narratives as well. The second point was the gap between what's found in the planning document, right, and then with the practice of planners on the ground. That's the super interesting point, obviously. Something that we really wish that we could kind of unpack in a bit more detail with this project, but because of COVID, we haven't really been able to do that kind of thick, descriptive ethnographic work that kind of point would kind of necessitate. But definitely that's a really interesting point, because it then it could point to the way in which those who are working on the ground with kind of formal planners might be able to as you say, reshape the narrative through their interactions with at the individual level. I'm not as familiar with this notion of the kind of discourse coalition, but yeah, I would like to hear a little bit more. It seems to suggest or be suggestive of the kind of the idea of the knowledge infrastructure as we kind of understand it as being connected to narratives being connected to particular forms of technical expertise or networks to some extent. But yeah, I would kind of be curious to know a little bit more about what we mean by discourse coalition. That's kind of a bit of a ramble, but thanks.
Just before we move on, Bobby, do you want to just say a couple of words about the ID card example? Because not everybody's familiar with it, and you didn't quite get to it in the presentation. Just explaining what that is.
So one of the issues around planning in informal settlements in the case of Nepal is obviously quite bottom down, technocratic, and connected to the definition of informality. There's certain kind of stipulations about how long one would have to have lived in this particular area to be to be considered an informal settler. So, for example, in Nepali, it's labeled Sukambasi. What seems to have occurred is that this label or this definition of informality has become contested. So questions arise over the authenticity of those settlers in these areas, how long they have been residing, the extent to which they have formal documents to say that they are landless, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that the Federation that have represented informal settlers have done is produce ID cards. And these ID cards have been used as a way of claiming that identity. So there's a politics around authenticity and around belonging that has occurred as a result of kind of the imposition of these ID cards. One of the things I'm trying to think through is the extent to which the use of ID cards is transformative in the sense that it goes beyond the kind of the logic of the technocratic planning model in the first place, or whether the extent it reproduces that, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that it reproduces a similar type of politics. Yeah, I don't know if that kind of addresses what you were trying to get me to talk about there, John, but yeah.
Thank you. Ronan, there were questions to you from Ari as well.
Sure, yeah, thanks so much, Ari. I guess, yeah, throughout the process, since January, I've been grappling somewhat with systemic risk. Is this the correct concept to be used when we're talking about fire and flooding? Localized fire and flooding. I suppose what is attractive about the concept is that it draws attention to how risk is embedded within wider systems and how we trace causal connections within systems. So defining the concept in a way that suits our paper might be stretching it a little bit, but certainly yeah, that's systemic nature of risk is I think helpful, and absolutely, yeah, the move towards more qualitative ethnographic research, yeah, providing the opportunity for bringing in the politics of participation, the opportunities for greater accountability as we have different narratives around causes of risk, depending on different stakeholders. I think there's a lot of potential there as we move through the process. Yeah.
Is there a challenge, Ronan, that as if the emphasis turns to complexity and emergence and risk as an emergent kind of property of the complex urban system, that you actually lose pathways of accountability, and we end up in a situation that kind of reduces the strength of the social contract because of the messiness of the way in which the system operates. And so I guess at a meta level, what does this mean for the right to the city if this is how we understand what the city is? And do you see that being ameliorated through the participatory dynamic?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, there's an inherent risk to the concept, yeah, the de-responsibilization of how risk operates in the urban context. Yeah, there's a lot of work going on within law and policy about how your responsibilities for disaster risk are distributed equitably. Does this unduly complicate the picture? But I think the argument around systemic risk, the argument around risk emerging from complex systems is so compelling that we're in turn compelled to engage with it on all of the implications for accountability that arise. Yeah.
I think this brings in Nimesh's question. Nimesh, do you want to speak to your question? To Ronan in particular, or this thing?
Sure, it's also an odd timing for me, for kids like coming. But yeah, I think it was really interesting papers both, but I was really like the idea of events-based analysis that Ron mentioned, but just was wondering if there is, I understand the value of doing it as an analytical sort of category focusing on a specific event. But in doing so, I wonder if there's any risk of like this turning into more kind of disasters. Some people call disaster sociologists tend to think this as a disaster exceptionalism in the sense that we're focusing too much on one disaster, and in the process we tend to undermine these larger socio-political drivers of which actually is your focus. Right, and so I thought there was a bit of a paradox there, and in fact, it also divert us from sort of looking at more cascading disaster, like when does one disaster start and the other begin? Like for example, I do research in Nepal, and there's like no stopping of disaster, for example. So I was just interested in that, and I think to Bobby, it's just I think it's a more of a clarifying question. If you could talk a little bit about how the study was conducted, but maybe also more substantively and methodologically, because Ronan was talking more about the value of single case study, right? A more in-depth case study, whereas you have like sort of comparative case study. And I'm just wondering, like, one, how, like, whose narratives are we talking about here? And are there any areas of convergence or divergence, or more generally, what's the value of doing like a comparative case study? Like just, what's the aim here? Thanks for fascinating presentation.
Thanks, Nimesh. Fantastic questions. Who wants to jump in first? Ronan?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Nimesh. That's an issue we were contending with. Certainly, an event-based process, as you say, it's a helpful analytical category, but it's also, I think, helpful for convening the attention and gaze of our stakeholders as we engage with them through the process. I understand as we do that, the risks of obscuring those broader processes. When we're selecting the events, the criteria that are used and that have been developed and that we are sharing with both the community level and more policy level stakeholders, these criteria for the selection of events are very clear around the need to select events that are representative to the extent possible of future risk, of the broader risk landscape. And so by taking that sort of set of in-depth cases, however artificially demarcated as disasters, that these are then somewhat amenable to that systemic work that we're interested in. I recognize the trade-off as we do that, though. Thank you.
Bobby, do you want to pick up the question to you? And then I think we're going to have another attempt with Jessica and see if her internet can cope with completing the presentation. Fingers crossed.
Hi Nimesh, thanks really for your questions. It'd be good to talk more if you're doing work in Nepal about some of the work you're doing. In terms of how the study was conducted, so we have partners in Nepal and Thailand who did kind of a policy document analysis over the course of the past kind of year of COVID. So the narratives that kind of we pinpointed were the ones that came to dominate the analysis of those documents. So two that were quite prominent. One was around kind of ecological degradation, so informality being conflated as being destructive to the ecology of, for example, the river in Kathmandu or to the canals in Bangkok. And then alongside that, in kind of relation to some of the counter narratives that were being produced by informal settlers and their representatives, were narratives around ecological restoration, right, to count as a kind of counterpoint, and kind of more broadly notions around kind of economic productivity associated with how kind of informal spaces were understood. What cut across that, I think, as Aria's also mentioned, right, in the Pakistan case, were these ideas of eviction, encroachment, right, which then enabled practices or strategies of eviction and relocation to occur. So that was a theme that connected both the Thai and Nepal case studies. Some of the differences would be like in the Nepal case, the politicization of informal settlements was quite strong, whereas in the Thai case, within the policy documents, that's almost completely absent. So what you have is basically informality being replaced by different kind of pejorative synonyms, right? Around poverty and so forth, or bottom 10%, and there's a myriad in the Thai policy document. So what the paper tries to look at is what are the kind of the deeper kind of political implications of these different forms and narratives and their kind of emergence. Hope that answers to some extent your question.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Jessica, can we invite you to try one more time with the presentation?
Okay, so I was talking about the dwelling space now. Okay. So in relation to the dwelling space in indigenous territories and how can we apply indigenous knowledge into nature-based solutions, I also wanted to say that as practitioners, we need to take a political position over the protection of indigenous territory. And according to an international intergovernmental panel on climate change report, there is enough evidence that indigenous and local knowledge is in fact extremely adaptable to climate variabilities and is of great importance to developing adaptation strategies. According to Berkes, some indigenous communities actively build a knowledge base of climate change because they use the land and the resources and develop the sensitivity to read critical signs and signals from the environment. If they were not constantly interacting with the land, they would not be able to respond effectively to what they were observing. This shows how knowledge and territory are interdependent. However, processes of land dispossession have shrunk the territory and is reducing their adaptive capacities. Moreover, the misunderstanding of indigenous and local knowledge can also play a role in cultural assimilation. The Asia Indigenous People Pact reported that a project, the REDD project, promoted the demonization of Sweden agricultural practices. This is a sophisticated use of fire to clear land in rotational farming as drivers for deforestation, which now they are banned altogether. This nature-based solution schemes, called REDD programs, did not recognize the negative impact this ban would have on their life, food security, and traditional knowledge. Thus, the lack of value given to these knowledge systems in nature-based solutions interventions can contribute to knowledge erosion, worsening quality of life, and providing ineffective interventions. Indigenous and local knowledge can help to place nature at the center of nature-based solutions. In the light of climate crisis and indigenous and local knowledge erosion, some indigenous people have proposed the urgent recognition of nature as subject of justice. From the indigenous perspective of justice, Earth is alive and imbued with spirit. In this view, a reciprocal set of duty and responsibilities between human and the rest of the natural world exist, such that relations between humans and non-human entities are maintained in a healthy balance, assuming these obligations are constantly met. Granting rights to nature is a claim inside the indigenous philosophy. It is embedded in Schober's fourfold environmental justice theory, and it was also adopted in the International Union for Conservation of Nature, First World Congress on Environmental Law, and currently there are 12 countries that have recognized legal rights to nature. So the notion of decentering humans within the concept of nature-based solutions, so as to refocus on nature as itself as a holistic and
Oh, what a shame.
I was about to talk about participation, the role of participation, parity in adaptive governance for nature-based solutions. So I prompted two questions. So how can indigenous and local knowledge contribute to achieving adaptive governance? And what does it take to enhance the participation of the indigenous and local knowledge holders in nature-based solutions? So adaptive governance can be conceptualized as including multi-level governance with a balance between top-down and bottom-up decision-making tailored to local context, giving the opportunities for experimentation and learning. Although there are many definitions of adaptive governance, it is highlighted the role of knowledge co-production as an institutional mechanism to enable learning and adapting. Therefore, meaningful participation can become the way to co-produce appropriate adaptive governance framework. Nonetheless, achieving meaningful participation is challenging when one takes into account uneven power relations. For example, in a coastal co-management program in Canada's Arctic, Armitage et al. Report that the government hired Inuit staff to work with researchers. But one participant claimed that no Inuit knowledge was included in the research, only their names were included. Parity of participation, in this sense, argues that people must have their own voice in decision-making in all stages of the partnership. This includes timely access to information about possible trade-off and all perspectives from the community. For Escobar's indigenous community, indigenous communities represent self-organizing systems. They reproduce, adapt, and transform themselves, responding to their environment as long as it does not hinder the continued process of self-creation. This is regulated by the politics of the communal assemblies. So for this, Escobar argues that indigenous communities need to be given autonomy so that can contribute, so that they can constitute a form of long-term adaptability relevant to improve nature-based solutions operability. Considering that autonomy is linked to the recognition of their knowledge territory, nature-based solutions must offer a tenure-responsive approach. This is related to the importance of land tenure rights from an empowerment standpoint because they place stakeholders who possess land in a far stronger negotiating position. To further achieve meaningful participation, nature-based solutions must address power relations between communities through the lens of gender inequalities around livelihood, perceived vulnerabilities, and access to information. In indigenous communities, livelihoods activities are gender differentiated. This happens in countries like Peru, but also it was reported in an ecosystem-based adaptation case in Nigeria, where the use of land for men's livelihood was affecting women's alternative to adapt in drought seasons. However, since men have a prominent role in decision-making and better access to information, they attended meetings about climate change more than women, who without this information were at disadvantage, and thus they lack the ability to understand and act on climate-related issues that affect them. And in cases in Peru, all the information about one ecosystem-based adaptation project that was developed inside indigenous territory was written, and it was in Spanish, when the majority of Awajún people only speak native languages and communicate in oral forms. Therefore, indigenous participation in designing communication strategies is crucial in nature-based solution adaptation. Finally, cultural humility. Cultural humility means for nature-based solutions that practitioners have to question the notion of experts. The goal of this is that we need to develop non-paternalistic collaboration with communities and to relinquish the position of as experts. As a professional, I reckon this is quite a challenge. And there is another case where in a co-production of REDD project, where practitioners were really committed to co-design strategies with Brazilian Kaxinawa people, but the practitioners require greater amount of compromise from the community more than themselves, imposing to a certain extent the use of scientific names and categories for different types of soil. At the end, the practitioners decided unilaterally new names for the soil classes, which the Kaxinawa did not validate. And as a result, this nature-based solution project, produced some useless maps, meaningless information that they were never used. Oh, okay. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that recognition and participation of indigenous and local knowledge holders can help to produce more just and transformative nature-based solutions towards social and environmental justice. And recognition and participation can be materialized through 4 strategies that can also be used as 4 factors of analysis. First one, the recognition of socio-ecological practices in the dwelling space. This is the understanding of indigenous land tenures in institutions, forest-based patterns, gendered livelihoods, and perceived vulnerabilities. Learning from the traditional practices of adaptation should contribute to adopt adaptive strategies in nature-based solutions, addressing the recognition of marginalized knowledge holders. Second, the reinforcement of land tenure rights and land security. Nature-based solutions should include the analysis of possible restrictions over land, land security, and that hinder adaptation for women and men, and prepare strategies to address this problem in order to strengthen their negotiating positions. Third, the continuous and intergeneral and gendered access to information. This is communication strategies and means deployed by nature-based solutions project must provide relevant information about possible risk, trade-offs for indigenous and local knowledge holders to be better decision in meaning makers of the world. And finally, cultural humility in the co-production and co-management decision-making to safeguard the process, these delicate processes of knowledge co-production, and to allow mutual learning so as to push towards adaptive governance. Alongside this is the need to ensure the provision of spaces of maneuver for indigenous leadership, including them in the process of defining roles, defining areas, in the needs, areas in need for improvement, and indicators of success as well. So this is it. Thank you very much for the patience and for listening to me.
Thank you, Jessica. It was brilliant. Great to get to the end because it was well worth hearing your entire presentation, and I really enjoyed that. And there's a lot of overlaps there, I think, with some of the premise of Bobby's presentation, particularly in relation to the significance of recognition. And in fact, actually, I see we have a question immediately from Bobby. Bobby, do you want to speak to the comment you've written in the chat?
Yep, no problem. Really like the presentation, Jessica. I just, my question's about, it's kind of a conceptual question. It's just about kind of naturalism and kind of the basis in which naturalism and this legacy of kind of modern science presents a problem for attempts to try to formalize indigenous knowledge institutionally. Is this a type of problem? So, you know, the categorization of nature and that is entailed with kind of modern scientific forms of intervention in conservation are quite distinct from indigenous ecological knowledge that that avoids that kind of splitting up of the natural world, right? It's considerably more holistic, as you've kind of really eloquently described it. So I'm just wondering if that paradox can be reconciled without, you know, further epistemic violence, so to speak, towards the pluriverse through this this kind of nature-based kind of project. Thank you.
Okay, if I understood correctly your question, definitely I think that's the reason why I wanted to analyze nature-based solutions, not only through ecological lens, but also as through an epistemic lens, right? Because I do think it's the big challenge for us, for practitioners, for those who live in Western societies, is to how can we see indigenous and local knowledge? Because it's not only indigenous, it's local people living in slums. They have different ways to relate to their environment than us living in big cities and everything. So I think the main challenge is to open our minds and reflect about our position when we are interacting with another type of epistemologies. And the idea, or I think the key idea, is that there's no promotion of indigenous knowledge as hegemony. What the colonial authors are looking for is to the convivence of different type of knowledges in the same position, you know. Yes, I mean, I think that's a big question for me. I mean, there's authors that have books talking about this and they have no final conclusion. But I do think it starts with our own reflexivity and positionality about nature and how we can also incorporate some of these indigenous traditions in our current life. I mean, if they can do it because they are incorporating technology and they're incorporating strategies that we use, you know, in the Western world, we can also open our minds to introduce their own wisdom. You know, I hope that answered your question. Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you, Jessica. Does anybody else have any questions for Jessica before I just move towards closing the session? Because I'm aware we're getting close to our deadline. Okay, if there are no further questions, then I just want to hand over to Richard Friend to give us the last couple of minutes and any closing reflections that might help draw together some of the diverse conversations that we've had today. And I say this recognizing the extent of the challenge that I'm laying at Richard's door, but I have complete confidence in his.
Thank you, John. To try and draw all this together, I mean, I think I have to say thanks to all three presenters. You know, you covered a lot of ground, and there's a lot to unpack in what you've presented. And I think, you know, hopefully over the two sessions that we have tomorrow, we'll have a chance to come back to these ideas. I mean, for me, and I'm also reflecting back on the plenaries and the previous session that I was involved in, which was about environmental justice. I think there's some interesting themes emerging through these discussions. I'm not really sure what to make of them, but I'll just try and pick up on a couple. I mean, I think one of them is certainly around complexity and what the significance of complexity or complexities is for us as academics working in this space, but also as we think about policy and practice and how to shape policy and practice. So there does seem to be sort of this recognition of complexities, but of course that also raises all kinds of complexities itself. I think something else that's really I found very interesting is that we're talking about policy and practice and implementation in different ways, and recognizing, I think, you know, all three presenters today, and similarly some other presentations I heard, talking much more in terms of policy as not just being contested, but negotiated spaces with different actors, using policy arenas as spaces for maneuvering and trying to exert influence. And I think that also raises some interesting questions as we think about the sort of complexity challenges and how policy engages in complexity. For me, policy, you know, it's founded on being able to simplify complexity to deliver some kind of solution that can be sort of recognized as such. And, you know, and that, you know, creates opportunities and roles and responsibilities for states in particular. But I think the other thing that really struck me, again, going through the discussions today and previous ones, is that we seem to be much more interested in knowledge again, and we have been for some time at DSA. It's never gone away, but it's much more center stage. And I think this is really interesting that we're talking about, you know, earlier today we were talking about cognitive justice. Today we're talking about epistemic justice, and, you know, so thinking about justice and knowledge and power in different ways, and knowledges and powers, and how to reconcile different knowledges in terms of our interest in participation. And again, with complexity and risk, providing new arenas for maneuvering for states and technocrats and certain kinds of ways of framing and shaping the world. I think that's also quite challenging. But it also, perhaps this is something that, you know, speaks more directly to what Jessica was saying as she was wrapping up. You know, what's the role of research as a process of producing knowledge and engaging in promoting participatory and empowering kinds of political processes? And maybe we need to think a little bit more reflexively and carefully about what we do as participatory researchers and promoters of certain ways and values of doing research. That's all.
Thank you, Richard. That was sensational, and I think gives us a great jumping off point for tomorrow morning. So you will all be very welcome to join us, and I hope you will, and that you're able to tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning UK time, where we'll have the second panel with 4 papers speaking to the same themes.
But we have a panel tomorrow afternoon at 3. Is that right, Bobby? The final panel?
2:15.
2:15.
Yeah,
sorry.
There's 2 tomorrow.
Yeah. So thank you all very much for your participation and attention during this session, and I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Goodbye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.